Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are around the world. Let me start by welcoming you to this African Perspective webinar, which will focus on the nexus between crime and violent extremism in the Horn of Africa. My name is Dr. Andrew Chi, a Senior Research Fellow for Africa Security and Obasanjo Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. The nexus between crime and violent extremism has been the concern of scholars and political entities for a while. While there has been a significant amount of research to suggest a link between crime and violent extremism, evidence of such relationship has been limited. Following the Duset attacks in Kenya, much has been written about how groups such as Al-Shabaab use crime as a funding mechanism and as an avenue for recruitment. During this webinar, the speakers will aim to bring together emerging evidence from the field. The speakers will provide policy-relevant advice for strengthening efforts to prevent and counter the threat of violent extremism. To discuss these issues and many more, today's panel is made up of three outstanding experts. Joining us on today's panel is Catherine Petrich. Catherine is a visiting researcher at the Center for Policy Research at the University of Albany and a lecturer at the Santa Clara University. Her research is primarily focused on insurgency, terrorism, and transnational crime in Northern and Latin America, the Horn of Africa, and South Asia. Catherine spends a significant amount of time in the field interviewing violent actors and their law enforcement counterparts. Our second panelist is Martin Zoitan. Martin is a senior researcher with the Terrorism and Conflict Program at RUSI. She is currently doing her PhD in Crime and Security Studies at UCL. Martin has lived and worked in the Horn of Africa for over a decade, specializing in research and program focused on studying violent extremism and Al-Shabaab. She has led prevention programs, disengagement projects, and supported risk management with regards to radicalization in prison. And finally, our last speaker, Mahedi Abdullah, who is the head of the Secretariat at the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers. He is currently completing his PhD thesis in the Department of Political and Economic Studies at the University of Helsinki in Finland. He has conducted research on counterterrorism groups such as Al-Shabaab in Somalia and in Kenya, and Boko Haram in Nigeria. He has also participated in several EU and Finland research projects on the diaspora's involvement in peace building in the Horn of Africa, and has previously worked for the United Nations. So without further waiting, I'll hand the floor over to Catherine, then to Martin, and then on to Mahedi, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. Catherine.
Thank you, Andrew. It's so wonderful to be here to be speaking about this really important topic that I think is starting to get some new and important attention, but we need to do a lot more research. And I think that these papers that we're going to talk about today are doing quite a lot for that. I'm going to be talking about my work in Kenya in winter of 2018. I was there conducting qualitative interviews for my doctoral dissertation that looked broadly at sort of what happens when terrorist groups run into crime. Do they do this intentionally? Is it an accident? How can we get into sort of the fine level data, because a lot of what we know is very high level quantitative data that doesn't do a really good job of exploring the intentionality of these relationships. So when I was crafting this question, right, looking around, it was very clear that crime was something that extremist groups were definitely involved in. And they were involved in deep and lasting and real ways. But there were a lot of disciplinary silos that were stopping conversations about how crime impacted groups, why terrorist groups who are nominally trying to show themselves to be legitimate governors would get involved, why, from the individual level, why criminals might join a terrorist network or a terrorist group. And so to sort of spoil my own punchline, right? What I found in Kenya and again in Colombia, where I did a comparative case study, but it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, is that terrorist and insurgent actors at an organizational level understand the pros and cons of getting involved in the illicit economy. And they choose to do so strategically. This means that their level of involvement might be different across types of crime or during different time periods, but that criminal activity serves a purpose for these organizations and it's not random. It's not that terrorist groups or violent extremist actors are just bulls in sort of the china shop of existing states, right? This is a strategic choice that is intended to advance the interests of their organizations. So I argue, based on my findings, right, for al-Shabaab, that the strategic logic of why they would become involved in crime is that it helps with funding and recruitment. Okay? There's a logic there. Crime is lucrative. That's why people do it, right? It makes money. And for a group that's been the target of quite a lot of financial sanctions and disruptions, particularly post 9/11, right? It's a revenue stream that's hard to cut off by governments and other legitimate actors, right? It's already money that is occurring outside of our sort of normal streams. The recruitment piece was a little more surprising to me. Why would you want to bring criminals into your ranks? Why would you, potentially welcome them? And wouldn't that sort of reduce your legitimacy currency with Somalis and Kenyan Somalis? As I'm sure my fellow panelists and many of our audience members know, doing research on illicit actors is really hard. It's sometimes, a lot of the time we end up coming at things very sideways and with smaller interview pools than we would perhaps prefer. So I have tried to account for that by interviewing a much wider range of of actors than we would perhaps normally see in these kinds of interviews. When doing sort of the background literature review for this project, it was very heavily weighted on quantitative methods and on actors who had been arrested and moved through the system, right? And a lot of the analysis was being done on court records, which is a sample, right? But it's not the whole sample. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to get out into the field and try to talk to people who were living in the context, right? Who were either willing to tell me that they were associated with al-Shabaab or their family members were associated, or that they were willing to tell me that they were involved in crime in some variety or another. The question that I always get when I give this presentation is, how do you know they aren't lying to you? And why would they talk to you? You don't know they're not lying to you, right? But we have some really good practices of how to try to triangulate that information so that you're not necessarily just taking everybody's word for exactly what they're saying, right? So I had a whole series of ways that we did this. One of them was having very long interviews for sort of in a typical qualitative project. It's much longer than sort of, I think a lot of people do, and trying to talk to a lot of people who are in kind of similar context, right? So that we can kind of, again, triangulate. In terms of access, I worked with a local Kenyan researcher who's in the process of applying to doctoral programs. He's actually just started in the middle of COVID. But because he still lives in the area and in the communities in which we interviewed, we decided it would be safer for me not to name him publicly. Together, we interviewed about 25 key informants, family members of al-Shabaab, self-identified criminals, community leaders, and a category that I called al-Shabaab adjacent individuals. I also interviewed another 10 or so domestic and local police, military officers, NGO officers, and UN workers to sort of round out the formal interview picture. Beyond that, I spoke between 100 and 150 sort of informal conversations, trying to find the right interview subjects for this and contextualize the on-the-ground picture, right? Primarily, I was in Majengo and Eastleigh when I was interviewing in Nairobi. I also did a significant amount of interviews with international law enforcement. And so those occurred in London, DC, Boston, and San Francisco. What did I find, right? That's what we're interested in, not necessarily what my methods are. Well, that crime and criminals are actually pretty useful to terrorist groups, and that al-Shabaab is leveraging them in Kenya for monetary support and for personnel. So looking at the recruiting piece of the story first, because I think that is probably the less intuitive, and it will tie nicely into Martina and Gatri's paper. But some of the reasons that recruiting criminals help terrorist groups include Terrorists are generally fairly bad criminals, right? Crime, like any other endeavor, right, is a learned behavior, right? Oftentimes terrorists get caught because they make basic mistakes that someone who has had a lifetime of experience in an adversarial relationship with law enforcement would perhaps not. The bigger one is that people get very squirrely when they are doing something wrong and are faced with authority, right? You have to learn how to kind of be calm, cool, and collected with it. My favorite sort of example of this, right, is the so-called Millennium Bomber, Ahmed Resem, who tried to drive 100 pounds of explosives from Vancouver, Canada to Los Angeles, but had food poisoning and then freaked out when he talked to the customs agent who was basically asking him to pull his car forward. And if he had just, sort of brazened it out, he would have been fine. In the case of Al-Shabaab, right, they're long enough, they've existed long enough, and they've been active long enough that a lot of these pitfalls have already gone away. So that's not necessarily a primary motivator, but having lower level members who already know how to skirt police attention, how to brazen it out of situations is useful, right? Criminals are often already familiar or possibly desensitized to the use of violence, right? And so may have already had some pre-existing weapons knowledge, which helps with training. Higher level or more sophisticated criminals can act as fixers, right, for integrating existing criminal economies with Al-Shabaab's broader financial plan, or for moving fighters in ways that avoid official attention. None of these are new skill sets for Al-Shabaab, right? They have a lot of this knowledge internally already, but it's broadening the sources, right? So it's another way to stay ahead of official attention and sort of the counterterrorism efforts that are involved. Okay. Additionally, right, criminals are also a vulnerable pool for recruitment, and it sounds sort of odd to frame it that way because oftentimes we don't talk about the vulnerability of criminals. But generally speaking, we sacrifice rehabilitation for punishment, right? So post-arrest sentencing, serving time, we don't necessarily do a great job of transitioning criminals back into lawful society. That's true in the United States. It's true in Kenya. It's one of the reasons we oftentimes see a really high rate of reoffending. When I was there, right, in some of the interviews with criminals who had been arrested, served time, and immediately just rolled back into, their gangs, there was a real sense, right, of what else am I going to do, right? I have to feed my family. I have to, live my life. What am I going to do? I'm obviously going to continue working with the people that I worked with before. There's also financial resources, right? So the people that I'm talking about are petty criminals, right? These are not, the Pablo Escobars of Nairobi, right? These are guys that are making a couple dollars a day. So one gang member, right, suggested he might join Al-Shabaab because he heard that they would pay a $25 medical bill for him. That was outside of what he could pay, and that they would front him the money, basically. Al-Shabaab is also able to offer a redemption narrative to young men. You're not worthless, you're not a shame, you're not a, whatever it is. You can join us and fight on the right and be redeemed, right? I saw less of that narrative, right? But it still definitely was present. It was still very interesting. I think Martine is going to talk a lot more about radicalization in the prison system, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it. But there are a couple of interesting things that were reported by different interviewees, both criminal and legitimate, was that Al-Shabaab seems to be involved in helping criminals make bail. That was a very interesting piece that I wish that I had a little more time to run down. But there were a couple of people who had this story of that Al-Shabaab was paying for a lawyer that would help you make bail, and then basically that they would jump bail and go to Somalia. So in terms of future research, that might be something to look at in terms of how Al-Shabaab connects to legitimate actors, right, to facilitate more recruitment. One of the things that I found in Kenya was that police violence and extrajudicial killings, particularly in Eastleigh, were acting as a real push factor for recruitment of criminals and gang members. There was a real feeling of, if we're going to get killed anyway, why wouldn't we fight back, right? Some interviewees also perceived Al-Shabaab and going to Somalia as kind of the ripcord on the parachute of, if if attention became too great in Nairobi, that they could always join al-Shabaab and go over the border and be sort of safe from police attention. Okay. Finally, right, criminals may see al-Shabaab as a means to make more money than petty crime, right? As we've established, these are not rich guys, but they oftentimes seem to fall victim to the same narratives that other sort of recruitment pools fall into, right? This self-improvement, economic security narrative of, if you come work for us, we will pay you good money, your family will be taken care of, all of those things. So, you know, right now, I've set this up to make it sound like this is a great thing for al-Shabaab, right? Including criminals diversifying into crime. It's not without its cost, right? It changes the organization. It creates competing goals, right? It empowers different actors internally, and it can impact how population perceives them. Recruits who join for their own reasons are perhaps more likely to defect, right? And former criminals might have the networks that would allow them to escape. Their loyalty is perhaps not as great as sort of these true believers, right? And so therefore they can represent an intelligence risk. It is a vulnerability to recruit criminals from an organizational perspective. However, al-Shabaab has navigated all of these issues before with other types of recruits, right? They seem to be confident in their organizational strength, even with the possible vulnerabilities. It will be interesting to see over time if this trend of bringing in petty criminals really starts to shift things, right, and makes the organization fragment. That's probably what I would expect to see if this was a negative effect, right, is that we start to get a lot of sort of little spin-offs that are competing with the main strength, but we'll see. Turning to crime as fundraising, right, al-Shabaab is remarkably diversified. Their largest market share is the extortion of businesses, which includes both licit and illicit businesses. For illicit activity, they take a share for the right of transport and seem to be fairly unconcerned about what is actually being transported, okay? So this contravenes some of the earlier reporting that painted al-Shabaab as deeply anti-drug, and I think that the anti-drug stance is definitely true in some places at some times. However, this was very interesting. I had both reports in Kenya and in Colombia with two different sets of interview pools about cocaine being moved through Somalia just as a transit point, not necessarily there was domestic consumption happening in Somalia, but that as a transit point onto the Middle East and onto Europe. I think a lot of it has to do with kind of who's on duty on the road that day. And so that is one of the reasons that we don't have a better understanding of how the drugs are moving, where they're moving, and who's involved. So if anybody's handing out grant money, I would be happy to go back and dig into that question in the future. I think the more interesting story in terms of crime funding in al-Shabaab is just how entrepreneurial they are, right? Usually when we're talking about crime, we talk about the big four of trafficking, right? Human arms, drugs, contraband goods, right? Al-Shabaab is involved in all of them, but they're also involved in smaller and regional specific criminal activities like livestock smuggling. That was one that was surprising to me. They're using cattle and goats as a way to launder money. Of course, makes total sense, but not something that I had heard about before I went, and not something that I've necessarily heard about a lot since. I heard a lot about how al-Shabaab was involved in the illicit or informal sugar industry, right? Of moving Brazilian sugar through Kismayo and then trucking it down to the Kenyan border. I had a couple of people tell me that the KDF was the people who were picking it up at the border. I have no way to verify that, so I don't want to sort of propagate that perspective without the large asterisk of who knows. Where does this leave us, right? We should understand that al-Shabaab is growing and evolving and seems to be very, very good at maintaining a narrative of being a legitimate governance actor while also recruiting criminals and engaging in criminal activity, right? It tells us that solutions are not drone strikes or kinetic campaigns, right? We cannot shoot this problem out of existence. This calls for long-term, hard institution building in areas like police oversight, prison reform, and petty and grand corruption, right? It tells us that some of our known and conflict management or mitigation tactics are going to be less effective than perhaps some of our law enforcement tactics, right? Further, right, al-Shabaab has become one of the most durable and sometimes one of the most innovative terrorist actors out there. they're previewing what other groups are going to do or have already started to do, right? We're starting to hear quite a lot about the same crime, terror, prison nexus happening in Europe, particularly for former ISIS fighters, right? We're also hearing about this happening in the United States. We're hearing about it happening in Mexico. My concern is, as terrorist groups diversify deeply into crime, right? This allows them another avenue to outlast disruption measures, right? And to sort of live to fight another day, right? That the sine wave of activity can go into a low place, and that they can simply wait out sort of the attention. Okay? I believe that we should take the nexus of crime and terrorism in the Horn of Africa very seriously, and I'm so glad to be here with like-minded people talking about this problem today. Thank you. Back to you, Andrew.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Catherine. I'll hand the floor to Martine.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew and Catherine. I'm kind of it's like I'm going to not shift gear a little bit, in a sense, kind of zooming in on an aspect where Catherine has touched about on broader issues. Mine is going to be a little bit more narrow. And I'm going to talk about a paper that I wrote together with Gayatri. We call it The Nexus Between Crime and VE in Kenya. So she's not on this panel because we thought we shouldn't be two people talking about the same thing, and we wanted to make sure we invite other researchers in to discuss the topic, but you'll see her name on the panel list. So she will also in the Q&A be able to chip in and add her thoughts and nuance, because she very much was leading this paper in the process. And I should also say that the paper was funded under the research component of the STRIVE2 program, which is funded by the European Union. And the overall purpose of that research component was to kind of gain a better and more evidence-based understanding of existing drivers of conflict and the patterns of recruitment to VE. So those of you who followed our work, you know we've done other publications that comes to this question from different angles. But in this particular topic, we were kind of, through our work on CVE in Kenya, we felt that there's a key interest in understanding the role of crime, and in particular kind of the role that criminal individuals and group, how that might they be linked to Al-Shabaab. And it was very clear that at community level, some of the youth we worked with, as well as among some of the law enforcement officers we also work within our capacity building program, they were sure that there was a very strong relationship between crime and violent extremism. We were not as sure in terms of what evidence was there to back that kind of assumption up, so we decided to explore it. But maybe we were not as brave as Catherine, but we definitely felt that, you know, identifying criminals and asking them about their relationships to Shabab, what was challenging under this program and very politically sensitive for the program. So we decided, let's look at it through a prison context. So there we started the process of negotiating access with the Kenyan Prison Service, as well as the prison management team in the prison we ended up doing the research. And I should just say that all of the findings have been validated by the prison management team, and we really appreciate all of the support they gave us in the process of, you know, taking their time in helping facilitate us coming and interviewing in the prison. So in terms of kind of narrowing down the scope of our study, we conducted a literature review and decided that we want to come up with like 3 key questions we thought were relevant. So 1, does violent extremist actors have a criminal history? And 2, does violent extremist organizations have relations with other criminal networks? And 3, whether prisons serve as a recruiting ground for VE. So kind of, you know, individual, organizational, as well as the physical infrastructure of a prison, whether that could kind of facilitate violent extremism. And that brings me to the methodology. Through our consultation with the prison management, we figured out who we could talk to and how we could do it. And we ended up interviewing the violent extremist offenders who were willing to talk to us. So we only talked to those who were willing to and volunteered, which were not all of them. And we conducted the interviews within the prison facility, but it's not allowed for us to be in their cells. So we found another place that was more feasible. And it was always in a position where the prison staff could monitor the situation, not necessarily overhear what we were saying, but they were always around. And most of the VEOs are Swahili speakers, and they were more comfortable being interviewed in Swahili, so we worked with a translator. We also interviewed female VEOs and minors who are placed in a Borstal facility, which is still within the kind of the larger prison context. So we ended up interviewing 9 convicted offenders, 8 men and 1 woman, and 6 remandees, so meaning those who are waiting for their conviction, 5 male and 1 female. And besides these VOs themselves, we also try to triangulate the findings with a justice advisor, with lawyers, paralegals, and prison staff who all kind of contributed to our data. And they were all semi-structured interview and qualitative largely. So in terms of the findings, I just wanted to highlight a few, and in the first couple, like the socio-demographic ones, they're really not very surprising. But I think, in research, sometimes you also have to document the unsurprising. So in terms of the socio-demographic, all of the respondents were under 35, and they were predominantly male. And this really corresponds quite a lot with other studies of the similar population. And similar with regards to education, 2/3 of them had not completed secondary education, which again also corresponds with other studies. And similarly, with regards to employment, most of the respondents were unemployed. Only a few were engaged in part-time employment prior to their incarceration. In terms of their conditions within the prisons, the violent extremist offenders and the remandees, they are separated from other prisoners, and they are not allowed to participate in vocational skill building activities. And when we asked them how they spent their time, mostly the male prisoners informed us that they mostly spent time reading religious texts, while the women, violent extremist offenders and remandees, they informed us that they were able to watch TV because the TV in the women's center is placed in a common room, which they can kind of see from their cell. So that was what they were doing mostly. And a part of this, they all said they had very little other sources of entertainment or preoccupation. And this is quite different for the juvenile VOs and remandees because that we interviewed, because they are not isolated from the rest of the inmates. They are allowed to integrate, and they have access to the same type of facilities as non-VOs and remandee prisoners. They have access to education and to other vocational services. And according to the superintendent in charge of the prison, that was because the juvenile VOs and remandees, they represent a lower risk category than the adult prisoners, and because rehabilitation and reintegration is a core focus of the program for the juvenile prisoners. So in exploring our question of crime and VE and asking the respondents about the circumstances that led to their arrest, all of the VEOs and remandees we interviewed, they stated that they had falsely been accused of their VE-related crimes. Either they had found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, or they had been framed by other actors. None of the respondents admitted to the crimes, and they further denied that they had previously been engaged in any VE activity. And this, again, is not very unexpected and very, it's something that comes up in most or in many studies of this kind. In particular with prison populations. And I think it's worth saying for the remandees in particular, who are not yet convicted, it was very hard for them to kind of, critically reflect on the circumstances leading up to their arrest because they were scared that it could influence their court case. Except perhaps for the juvenile prisoners who were more sort of forthcoming in our conversations. So when we're exploring the 3 main research questions, we were able to kind of uncover the following insights. So with regards to the individual level, we found very limited evidence of an overlap at individual level. And in keeping with that assertion of their innocence, the VEO and remandees that we interviewed, they also denied having a criminal past. They actually denied that criminals were routinely recruited into joining extremist groups at all. But I think it's important that I add to this that in the Kenyan system, however this is currently improving, there's no electronic database. So unless the specific officer who books the individual, or the reception officer who books the individual who comes to the prison, recognizes that person. There's no other way of checking that he has been there before. And these guys, they always change their name. So it's actually, you know, they have to recognize them physically. So that's of course not feasible. But this, since we did the study, this has changed. So that's a really good thing. Secondly, at organizational level, very few instances of overlap were identified between criminal groups and violent extremist organizations. The only aspect of potential overlap were reported in the case where gang and VE groups recruit from the same areas and within the same demographic group. So it was clear that in certain areas of Mombasa County, the prison officers, they identified them as being high risk for both VE activity and criminality. So in that sense, we could perhaps consider that at certain times and places, there is some relationship of convenience that can emerge between the criminal groups and the VEOs, but that this relationship is not necessarily strategic or consistent. So finally, looking at prison as an institution and a context of radicalization, we found that there does appear to be a clear organizational structure in the prison where there's a leadership that directs and controls whom and what that can be talking about, you know, as a consequence of their isolation from the general population. They appear really to gravitate towards each other, and they acted in concert. So this is very similar to other studies of similar contexts, that it kind of follows a prison gang model. Yeah, and this was found primarily in the context of the male prison, but not in the female or in the Borstal institution. So in conclusion, and with all the caveats of the limitations of our study, given who we spoke to and the limited number of respondents, that we found that we really did learn a lot about the setup and the context in the prison. And I think we were also able to kind of nuance the fact that prisons are not necessarily like a breeding ground for extremism. It's all about how it's managed, the capacity of the staff, as well as the overall policies and directions that is provided politically. So in terms of understanding the deeper question of individual and organizational overlap, we concluded in the paper that it's more a case of convenience at certain times and not a consistent approach, which highlight again the agility and adaptability of Shabab, and perhaps that they operate a little bit more like a business network than necessarily like an organization with a very clear strategy and direction. So finally, it's very clear that there's a lot more research that needs to be done, and to really dive into these questions, you know, going back perhaps to the same population, talk to them more, talk to them for a longer time, talk to them after they release. There's many aspects of the research that could strengthen or nuance further kind of the understanding of these topics. So with that, allow me to head back over to you, Andrew, and again, also invite Gayatri to share further feedback during the Q&A. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martine. And lastly, but not least, Mahedi.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Martine. Today, I'm going to present a paper, a study that we did in Kenya from 2017 to 2019, looking at the linkages between counterterrorism and recruitment into violent extremism in Kenya, as well as the role of Kenyan criminal justice system in relation to violent extremism. This study was funded by US DOS, and we had 4 partners involved in this research. So we had the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers, we had Muhuri, we had Finchurch Aid, and Kenya Muslim Youth Alliance as research local partners. The interviews were conducted in 8 counties in Kenya: Mombasa, Kilifi, Tana River, Kwale, Lamu, Garissa, Wajir, and Nairobi. These were areas that we thought had a number of vulnerable individuals who susceptible to radicalization and recruitment. And we wrote a paper out of that. The interviews, we interviewed at 3 different groups. We interviewed individuals, 161 individuals who have been arrested, detained, or convicted on terrorism charges in Kenya, 110 family members and friends, and 114 officials from the criminal justice system and Kenyan government. So, for example, we had police, correction officers, individuals representing the judiciary, and prosecutors. In addition to the face-to-face discussion, we had 16 focus group discussion, 2 focus group discussion in each of the counties. So that's 8 counties times 2 focus group discussion. And 15 to 25 people participated in each of these focus group discussions. Well, primarily we were looking at the correlation between the criminal justice system and whether that has had impact in the radicalization in Kenya. We also did have some questions with regards to a follow-up question, looking at the backgrounds of the individuals, whether it is their past criminal history, whether their education system, whether their marriage status, their relationship with the police, or an interaction with the police and the criminal justice system. So it was almost a 3-year study, and the findings were, I can share some of the findings, but I don't know how much time I have. But to the question of whether there is a correlation between the crime and violent extremism, we didn't find any direct correlation except some indirect linkages, I suppose. For example, some of the individuals that were interviewed have been or were sympathizers of Al-Shabaab at the time, even though they have denied committing any of the crimes that they have accused of, and the reason why they were in prison. So the 161 individuals, some of them were released. So we interviewed them outside the prisons, but we had a large number of them in prison that we had access to. We got the access from the prison officials and the Ministry of Interior. So we spent almost 8 months trying to get this access, which was not an easy thing to do. So there was the fact that they were sympathizing with an organization that are committed to terrorism. We thought that the idea that terrorism itself is a crime could have a linkages. There could be a linkages between a crime and violent extremism from that angle. Some, not all, of the interviewers had also had a past criminal conviction, and some of them had been accused of committing a non-terrorism related crime in the past. So they had that confusion. They had, even if they also deny having anything to do with criminal, they say that because they were convicted simply because they were Muslims and they haven't done anything, but they nevertheless had that kind of past history. Also, when we interviewed individuals, Al-Shabaab members in Somalia, we also ran into Kenyans, members of Al-Shabaab, who actually ran away from Kenya to avoid convictions and jail sentences. So, and these guys became members. Similarly, in Nigeria, when we did the interviews in Nigeria, we found a number of non-Muslims who, in that paper, actually, we interviewed 17 non-Muslims who were actually members of Boko Haram. Some of them have been forced to join, but others have joined the organization simply because they were either running from the authorities, or they wanted revenge to avenge on behalf of a family member who have been either killed or harmed by the Nigerian military. So that was another angle that we also looked at it. We also interviewed individuals, Al-Shabaab members who were also exposed to Al-Shabaab violent behavior, because they've been to Somalia, they came back to Kenya, and that's one of the reasons why they were in prison. And others who have also came back from Somalia, and they talked about their training there. So there was also that kind of exposure of violent behavior from Al-Shabaab belonging to the organization. We also thought that because if you compare, for example, the way that the criminals generally talked about their dislike for police and judiciaries, the members that we interviewed really disliked police, and they displayed an anger. In fact, one of the main reasons we found that Kenyans have joined Al-Shabaab was anger towards the police, and other criminal justice institutions. So there was also that anger and hatred towards the criminal justice system and the police as an institution. Then, if you look at the way that Al-Shabaab collect revenues, for example, it is like a mafia-style kind of organized crime. So we thought that there is some sort of similarities between the organized crime and how Al-Shabaab organizes itself, whether it is organizing an attack or whether it is collecting revenues such as money. For example, in Mogadishu, for example, if you have ever been to the way that they collect, they have a list of how many people have shops in certain part of the city, and they actually dedicate 1 or 2 individuals for every 10 or 15 shops in certain areas. So, so it is very, very mafia-like style organized crime. And finally, I just want to say that the way that there is a certain criminal activities that are very common to a normal criminal, and the violent extremism individuals. For example, the possession of illegal weapons, they don't actually see it as a crime. They see it as a protection, personal protection, and they have a right to carry it, even if they know that they don't have a license or to carry those weapons. This is some of the things that we found out in some of the research we have done. And back to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So we have a few questions. So what I'll do is I'll start with the first one, and really, I think the first one is geared towards you, Martin, and it's actually asking about the link between prisons and what is taking place. So I was wondering if you could address that first question.
Yeah, and it's about the extent. The extent is, of course, really difficult to assert. Like practically in Kenya, violent extremist offenders, both remandees, so like accused but not necessarily convicted, and the convicted ones, have to be kept in the higher ranking prisons. So, you know, either it's called main prison or maximum security prison, because they're not allowed, as I was saying, to mix with the general population and to engage in vocational rehabilitation activities. So they are in very few locations. Some of those are better resourced than others. You know, the literature widely tells us that if staff are not well trained on how to manage violent extremist offenders, it can potentially contribute to making the problem worse. And it might, you know, give them opportunities to talk to each other and could, contribute to further radicalization in the prisons. However, for example, in the prison where we did the interviews, the staff are very well trained, are very aware with this problem, and they are linked up to the different security agencies. I think the policies of what, other parts of the literature also suggest that keeping them in isolation is not necessarily contributing to rehabilitation at all. Whereas if you give them opportunities of, for example, vocational skills and so on, it might be that they are able to find other meaningful ways of life after their sentence has completed. So if you want to reduce recidivism and like kind of try and seek to do some rehabilitation with the prison management, isolation and keeping them away from vocational activities is not necessarily the most helpful approach. So I think that's looking at within the prison context, but also looking at prisoners once they come back out into society. So the extent is not very easy to kind of assert, but it's certainly a problem. And if not well managed, it can very easily grow.
Gayatri, did you want to jump in on that?
No, not this one. I think the other question that was posed was specifically about the prisons, which is how did we sort of talk about violent extremism in that context? So maybe you can just go into answering that one.
Sure.
So yeah, that's a really good question, because it is very difficult to actually just talk about violent extremism, particularly because it's extremely sensitive, given the prison context. It was very sensitive, and also that in like terminology, it's not easily interpretable. So we had to like sort of try to do that, and in a way in which talk about violent extremism by talking about it in a contextualized sense. And by that I mean, we talked about MRC, Mombasa Republican Council. We also talked about Al-Shabaab, while not sort of naming them in that way. So we talked about groups and names which were known. Even when we talked about criminal gangs, we kind of like referred to gangs which are known to be in Mombasa. We didn't sort of talk about crime. Like we didn't sort of use judgmental terminology as such. We just kind of used pronouns proper nouns to sort of define them. That was helpful.
Brilliant. I guess a question which is mostly for all of the panelists, so do get ready. The question comes in from Stephen. It says, what evidence or cases have the panelists found in their research on the connection between Al-Shabaab, I'm assuming AS, and environmental crime, i.e. illegal wildlife trafficking, illicit mining? If any, what order of magnitude do these crimes have in AS funding model? Who would like to go first?
I'll jump in.
Brilliant.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I heard a lot about wildlife trafficking and illicit mining from people who were not in Kenya. That seemed to be something that people were very interested in. But I didn't hear anything from my interviewees about it. It may have been because it's a very urban environment, right? And that they weren't necessarily involved in that piece of it. But I unfortunately don't have a conclusive, yes, they are, or no, they aren't.
Mahedi, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, in the case of Al-Shabaab, we found that charcoal trade was a major factor, and that brought a lot of revenues to Al-Shabaab, especially when they used to control areas that had ports. And similarly, at the moment, there is a lot of fishing that's ongoing, and that's profiting Al-Shabaab. So those are the two things that we found from environmental perspective that normally illegal. First of all, charcoal trading is illegal in Somalia, but that is something that they have benefited from all around, and especially export. Charcoal exporting is illegal. Thank you.
Martin, did you want to come in on that, or are you okay? Okay. I'll move on to the next question. So the next question is really a pointed towards Martine, so forgive me for this one. It says it was suggested that it was suggested to no interviewees acknowledge, or it was suggested that no interviewees acknowledged guilt regarding VE charges.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that the interviewee may have differed in what was counted as VE. How did the study overcome differences in how VE is defined? And that is from Elliot.
Yeah, I think the Gayatri partly answered it before. They didn't acknowledge guilt with regards to VE charges, but also not crime charges. They just thought that somebody had done something to them. They were being fixed. They had been at the wrong place at the wrong time. It was wrong that they were there. And you're totally right, Christopher, that how you talk about these topics is really difficult. And as Gayatri was saying, we try to use unjudgmental local language, like using the names of the groups in Mombasa that we know as criminal gangs when we talk about it, but we use their actual names. And then we kind of, talked around it. And it's very hard to get a very specific answer because it's so difficult for them to be willing to talk to you. The population of offenders that are convicted of terrorism offenses are much larger than the ones that we talk to, and that's simply because many of them were not willing to talk to us, and that was largely because perhaps they were instructed by what we thought were their leader not to talk to us, and that the ones that are convicted and are the most serious in that sense, they are also the ones who would have a problem about what you call the more low-level offenders, if you want. They are perhaps not always as ideologically, they don't think in those terms necessarily. Like on a large, like on a light note, I remember I sat and discussed with our translator about Kenyan politics, and then a couple of them, they engaged immediately about the opposition party and who should do what, and I immediately thought, hang on a minute, if you're so clued in on Kenyan politics and willing to talk about it, clearly you are not like against the state, dismissing the whole system, so talking about other issues can also help give you an idea kind of whether they are believing in a whole different system of organizing the world. Finally, sorry to talk a little bit like a long time on that one. They are certainly, like, I think the most the ones who are most deeply involved in Al-Shabaab, who sit in the prisons, they are most likely also very, very good at navigating what they can say to who. So it's likely that they will talk in a certain way because they know immediately what you're after. So, you have to be be mindful of how they are presenting information, because they think that that's what you want to hear and how you want to hear it. So it's really difficult to have these conversations. And that's why the triangulation is everything. Like, I think really our in-depth conversations with the prison officers gave us as much information as the interviews with the offenders themselves. Thanks.
I wondered if I could ask or use my power as chair and ask a wider question to all of the panelists. And it's really about whether you got a sense, and I know that obviously you're looking at the connections, but a sense here of whether there was wider links or wider connections. And then particularly thinking about what more recently, the link between Islamic State and Islamic State Greater Sahara, and whether you found any greater links to maybe ADF or other regional terrorist groups or non-state armed groups that may be operating in the areas that you went to do your research on.
Can I go for who do you want
Sure.
to go? Okay, sorry, Catherine and Mahdi, I'm sure you want to answer that one. I think that is a little bit beyond the scope of this study, but kind of allowing our other work to come into play. What I think is changing right now in Kenya is that they are not, recruitment to Islamic State in Syria is not as attractive anymore, but in particular for the coast, going south to Mozambique is becoming much more of an option. So, to an extent, I think that is what we are likely to be seeing, that people are going south, and guys from south who are Kenyans are going to come back. yeah, so the links with Islamic State in Mozambique are going to be the major thing I think we're going to see in the coming period, in particular for the coastal recruitment patterns.
Catherine, do you want to jump in?
Of course. Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I didn't hear that from any participants that I would classify as criminals or terrorists who sort of got coded that way in the interview scheme. But I heard about it quite a lot from NGO people and people who worked on CVE in Nairobi, that they were hearing. So of course, this is now second, third hand, that there was a narrative by Al-Shabaab recruiters about basically come to Somalia, get your bona fides, get, some status, know what, and then go on to fight in Syria, and you will have a higher status and you will be better. And of course, you never make it out of Somalia, but that is part of the recruitment narrative. It's I think possible, probably less so today as Islamic State kind of devolves out. But I didn't necessarily hear that from anybody who was thinking of going.
Mahedi.
Yeah, I think there has been, we did some work in Mozambique, and there is a clear connection between what's happening on ground and the penetration that was ongoing at the moment with people being recruited for Islamic States. So I tend to agree with Martin that there is an area where the link between that part of the world and Islamic State is very, very strong. But if you look at from European perspective, there has been a lot of Somalis, Kenyans, Tanzanians leaving Europe to go to Syria, for example. So I think the linkages is more on the European side than more on the Somalia side as such. But as everybody perhaps knows, there is a clear link between the Al-Shabaab in Kenya and Somalia and Al-Qaeda, for example. So that is a very strong, well-established link there. Back to you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And Catherine, there's a question that's coming for you, which is question number 5. And the person's asking, have there been instances where gang members act as an independent contractors or independent contracts for VEOs to carry out violent attacks? What challenges or what challenge does differentiating between full-time membership to VEOs versus those who are adjacent pose to research of this nature?
That's a great question, right? And differentiating between kind of the true believers, full-time people and the people who are there, weekend warriors, so to speak, is real and very challenging. I think that you're much more likely to see relationships between criminals and VEOs for not what we would consider to be like a terrorist attack, right? They're not delivering bombs or what have you, but enforcing contracts, right? Collecting rents, things like that. I think that kind of level of activity, absolutely. I heard about that a little bit. Or finding people actually was the sort of the most common that they would hear from somebody that we're trying to track down, whoever, and do you know who he is? And if you do, we'll pay you a bounty. And so then the gang would perhaps go out and try to find him. But I don't think that at least I did not find in this study that there were instances of criminals being paid to plant bombs or what have you.
I had one more question, if possible, and forgive me, I'm using my position again. But the question really is about, Catherine, you spoke about this issue of conflict mechanism processes that are effective, as you said, or maybe not as effective as law enforcement mechanisms. And I wonder if you could touch on a little bit more about how you see that.
So I think oftentimes we, sort of the collective we, think about responding to violent actors as though, in sort of a simplistic way, in terms of like how we think of state-on-state conflict, right? They're armies, they need to be met with armies, and that we can do something through a kinetic engagement to sort of destroy the network, which I think has proven, right, over time that isn't necessarily the case, right? Even if you have an extremist network that holds territory, right? They're not necessarily going to be eliminated through military means. Whereas from kind of coming a little bit more from the law enforcement perspective, right? And you're trying to, this is a little bit hard. You're trying to pull individuals out of organizations, right? You're trying to disrupt networks in kind of a tiered fashion. And you're really focusing on establishing institutions, right? Legitimate institutions, rather than kind of overriding them in a conflict way, in a kinetic conflict way. Obviously, there's quite a lot of gray area between military means and law enforcement means. And the United States is currently really having a hard time with the militarization of law enforcement, right? But I think it demonstrates that we hear a lot about community policing, right? And a lot about having people from the community doing sort of these institution building activities. And it's almost sort of become the bumper sticker that you slap on something, right? But it really is true, right? Rather than trying to have kind of the invading force come in and force compliance, right? If you can have community-led solutions that are interested in building law and justice and really having effective oversight, I think that you're going to have a much better long-term solution. The problem is that is measured in generations, right, rather than in political terms.
Brilliant. And I'm going to pass over to Martin, who's going to answer a question from Dominic.
Yeah, hoping that everybody, so what Dominic Blanca is asking us, kind of both, all of us, whether we are actually going deep enough in exploring the links, and emphasizing that a little bit more. And I guess what I wanted to say was that, the redemption narrative and the kind of the skill transfer narrative has very, some like in the literature, in some texts it has very strong evidence, in others it's disputed. So it's not very clear that, they are as strong as some would say. And what I was trying to say, and you're totally right, we talked to a really number of people who are really difficult to get something meaningful out of. So of course that is not the full picture, but it does still give us something. And I think it's fair to say that Catherine has talked to another population and Mahedi to another one, and they all contribute to illuminating this problem from different perspectives. What I guess I would caution against having an assumption that all criminals are potential joining Shabab because of redemption. So like when we think of the consequences of that, we should not design our CV intervention or prevention work in criminal groups. It's because then it would be taking that link too far, if you see what I mean. I agree with you that there are some known cases of criminals who've ended up in Somalia, and I think the UN monitoring group highlighted a few in their last report. So clearly there's evidence of a few guys, and surely for Al-Shabaab it's meaningful to have some criminals in some positions because they can they have skills, but that does not mean that it's we should overstate that link, neither at individual nor at organizational level. What we thought was much more powerful was in certain places, in certain parts of Mombasa and certain parts of Nairobi, there's a lot of recruitment to both violent groups and to criminal networks, and most likely guys who are returning back from having joined Al-Shabaab or ISIS. That also might be where they could find jobs. So, the other way around, that when you come back, you're also looking for something to do. It's those places to me that are interesting, where everything collides. What is it about those places? So when we're looking to think about how we use this information. Maybe those places are the interesting ones, and the youth who are in those places, they could be at risk because they are at the wrong place at the wrong time, because there's both recruiters and there are gangs around that are offering alternatives in their lives. So that was what I was trying to say. Let's not overstate the relationships, but let's look more at certain places where both actors are present and could reach out to these young people.
Brilliant. We could go on and obviously take more questions, but we've run out of time. And this brings us to the end of this webinar. So I'd like to thank Catherine, Martine, and Mahedi for their insights into the nexus between crime and violent extremism. And for those of you interested in upcoming events and research, please head to our website for more information. Thank you very much and have a lovely day wherever you are.